Steve Smith, CEO of Airlink, and thank you for joining me for another episode of FlightPath. Here we aim to highlight innovation, deliver insight, actionable guidance, and lessons in best practice to people working in the humanitarian response and disaster logistics space, all from experienced leaders. And please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. My guest today is an international development and policy professional with 30 years of experience working in Washington, D.C., Europe, and the Middle East. Amongst the many notable offices he's held, for 3 years he served in the Obama administration as Chief of Staff and Chief Operating Officer at USAID, an organization with a budget of $1.7 billion, 9,500 staff, and operating 84 missions around the world. Some 20 years ago, he served as Chief of Mission for the National Democratic Institute in the West Bank and Gaza and lived in East Jerusalem. And today he's President and CEO of ANERA, an organization that provides humanitarian assistance and sustainable development to advance the well-being of refugees and other vulnerable communities in the Middle East. Sean Carroll, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve. Great to be here.
Great to have you too. Well, I'm very grateful for you making the time to speak to me today because I know you're a very busy man. And in many senses, I know that ANERA is truly at the sharp end of the world's response to the Beirut explosion that killed over 200 people and left at least 5,000 wounded and 300,000 homeless. So maybe, Sean, if you would, why don't you start by telling us a little bit about ANERA?
Sure, absolutely. So ANERA is a U.S. NGO that was formed in 1967-68, right after the 67 Arab-Israeli war in response to the ensuing refugee crisis. And we've worked with refugees, with Palestinians, with refugees, and only in the Levant region, only in the Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, in Jordan, briefly in Iraq. Perhaps someday we'll work in Syria, but really only in the Levant region, and with refugees and vulnerable populations. It's over 50 years old and always has worked on humanitarian response and on sustainable human development, and always trying to see what can we do when we're doing emergency response or humanitarian assistance. How can we best make that sustainable human development?
And so, as I said in my introduction, ANERA is playing a key role in the response effort in Beirut. Talk to me a little bit about how that happened, how that came about.
Well, we have a fairly large presence in Lebanon, about 60 staff, all local, in 6 offices in Beirut and in the north and the south in Bekaa Valley, and doing a lot of development work, but had been doing humanitarian response since last October with the political revolution and the economic crisis, which helped spark the revolution, increasing poverty and unemployment because of COVID and the economic crisis, increasing food and health insecurity. And so we were already doing a lot of humanitarian response, and the August 4th Beirut blast just increased in a dramatic way the need to respond to an acute crisis and respond quickly. But we were there already with the staff, with the offices, doing a lot of medical donations, doing cash for work and cash assistance, doing some food distribution. And actually we had adapted our vocational training program so that many of the youth who previously were getting vocational training in jobs that did exist in mobile phone repair, in air conditioning installation, in construction, in hospitality, some of those jobs dried up, and we had converted them to doing humanitarian response, and they were doing food prep and catering, but for humanitarian food delivery, and making masks, PPE, face masks, and hand sanitizer in response to COVID. So we were well prepared to respond, and particularly on the medical donations, we do a lot of that each year. And the blast means that we're going to see a huge increase. We have seen already a huge increase in the response, in the number of medical donations, in the size, in the speed. And so we may do up to 10 times what we did in the previous year.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the last thing anyone needed, the Lebanese people needed, was the explosion. And so now, having a deep knowledge of the country and the region, you know, can you talk to me a little bit about maybe some of the unique difficulties that are particular to this disaster that you've sort of had to overcome it? Obviously, you were there on the ground, as you've just said, for a long time before and had a good operation going. Talk to me a little bit about some of the difficulties that have been driven by this explosion.
Sure, and I don't have a deep expert knowledge of Lebanon. Thankfully, our team does, as I mentioned.
Sure.
We have a staff of 60, and they're all local staff, mostly Lebanese, but also Palestinian and Syrian. But I can tell you, it is a unique country, and uniquely. I mean, the blast was both a consequence of some of the negligence and greed and corruption that exist, and it exacerbated it. In the Lebanese people and Beiruti in particular are saddened and shocked by the tragedy. They're also angered that it happened, that these tons of ammonium nitrate were left in a warehouse, and officials had been warning government ministers about it. And so the Lebanese they're upset. They're tired of not having a government that can take care of these kinds of issues. So that makes it tough. Now we're a non-governmental organization. We work with non-governmental partners, but we also you need to work with the governments that exist at the national level, at the local level, and we're able to do that as well. I don't think I don't think you can get good work done if you're not able to work with all of the stakeholders and figure out how to get work done given local systems, given the local environment. But I know that I'm not Lebanese, but I know that my colleagues, they're frustrated. They're frustrated at a situation that would allow, it's an accident, but many people feel like it's an accident that could have been avoided. And you see the response, it's the people themselves that are coming out and cleaning up the debris and organizing food and water and hygiene and medical distributions. The medical distribution is obviously done through hospitals and clinics, and that's where an organization like ANERA and our partners like Airlink and FedEx and Direct Relief and AmeriCares and a whole lot of partners who are in the business of doing medical donations are critical. But a lot of the work is being done by citizens and civic organizations, and new organizations are cropping up either as a result of COVID and dealing with that pandemic, and now shifting to respond to the August 4th blast, or even some NGOs have sprung up in direct response to the blast, knowing that or feeling that the government isn't going to be able to do everything that's done. There's a fiscal crisis and a banking crisis, and so it's really tough to get the funding, get the resources. President Macron of France is in Beirut today. I know that he and other governments have been promising aid, but also saying the aid will be conditioned on reforms, and I know that the Lebanese people want to see some of those reforms happen.
Yeah, understood. And I think that you mentioned the political revolution. Of course, at the outset here, we had the resignation of the government, and that's obviously had a significant impact on all organizations responding. That's fully understandable. It's difficult enough as it is to respond in disasters and humanitarian situations. In terms of the needs on the ground, what are you aware of that are sort of the most significant needs at the moment? And just in terms for people's reference, I mean, timestamp. I mean, we're now a month from the blast itself. Yeah.
Just about exactly this moment, 4 weeks ago was the blast.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Many thousands are still out of their homes. They aren't all homeless because many are staying with friends and family, and actually some shelters have been set up and are not very used because they would rather stay with friends and family. But that can only last so long. People need to get back into their homes. So they were forced out of their homes, some 300,000 by the blast. Some of those are back. It's the numbers are in the thousands of homes that were damaged, either lightly or moderately or more significantly. We and many others have are not just plans, we are actually actively rehabilitating homes. We've rehabilitated 16 so far. We're working on 100 right now, and we've surveyed 550. We have plans to rehabilitate about 800, and if the funding comes, we would hope we could do more than that, because the number is in it's about 10 to 20,000 of each of those categories. So you're talking 50 to 100,000 homes that need to be rehabilitated at some level. So that's the big need. But of course, as I said, this blast comes on top of the COVID pandemic, which Lebanon has dealt with fairly well, but some loosening of movement restrictions, some Lebanese coming back home, and then the blast itself did make for congregations of people, and there's been a spike in the numbers of infected, and hospital supplies were severely depleted. Those in and near Beirut were severely depleted when they treated 6,000 wounded after the blast. And so you had this blast coming on top of a series of crises, political, economic, banking, fiscal, the pandemic. And the question is, how much can the hospitals and the primary healthcare clinics absorb, and how much can the people do at a time when you have a caretaker government and international aid being conditioned on reforms? A very, very difficult situation. And even Lebanese with means, with wealth, can't always get all of that wealth. And so there is a huge, unfortunately, a huge need and reliance on international organizations like ANERA. What's heartening is what the response has been. Now, we hope we can work with our donors to say, the need was already up here, and the blast created a surge of need, but it's not that the need was down here at ground level, and the blast was the only spike in acute need. It just exacerbated it. And so even as we clean up from the blast, the debris, we get people back into their homes, we get hospitals resupplied with medicines and medical supplies, you still have a series of crises to deal with. So we're there. We're not going anywhere. We've got programs. We have support from the UN and support from individuals and family foundations, and a lot more support after this blast. It definitely mobilized a lot of support, and that's the one heartening thing in this otherwise pretty horrific tragedy.
Yeah. Well, you guys are obviously very committed to the people of within Beirut and Lebanon, and it's clear you're there, and you're there to stay. And I hope you get that support. From Airlink's side, we'll certainly try and help as much as we can, as we already are. Lebanon is the base of about 1.7 million refugees, mostly Syrian, which is the largest sort of per capita population of Syrian refugees in the world. How has this disaster and the political, economic, social turmoil impacted the refugee community?
Yeah, it's a good question and an important one. I mean, again, I think it's the overall crises that are really what makes conditions and life difficult for the Syrian refugees and the Palestinian refugees who've been there for 40, 50, 70 years. The blast affected Lebanese more than Syrians and Palestinians because of where it was, and ANERA works with all communities in all of our programs, but because we work with the most vulnerable, our work has mostly been with Syrians and Palestinians. But unfortunately, increasingly, because of the economic crisis, we had been working with more Lebanese. Not so much in Beirut, more in the north, in Tripoli and Akkar, in the south, in Bekaa Valley, where there is more poverty among the Lebanese population. Syrians and Palestinians have got to be worried. It's just one more thing on top of an already difficult situation. I tell you, one other heartening thing is that many Palestinians stepped up to help in response to the blast. Some of the hospitals in the Palestinian camps in Beirut received patients. Haifa Hospital at Burj al Barajna camp, which is a hospital that ANERA has worked with, and donors of ours recently, in fact, supported a rehabilitation of the emergency room. And the emergency room saw 300 victims of the Beirut blast, and it's quite a distance. I think it's about 10 kilometers from the blast. 300 patients that night. One day when I was there, and we were working with youth to do distribution of food and hygiene kits, there was a group of Palestinian youth from the Burj al Barajna camp who had come to the center of Beirut, a place that, for all intents and purposes, is off limits to them. They can't work there or travel there easily. They came to volunteer and help respond, and I asked them why, and they said it's human. It's a human response. We're helping. Another interesting thing is that the grain silo that you see in the photos now of the devastation, where the entire port area was flattened, the grain silo is still mostly standing. That was built by a Palestinian. That grain silo saved hundreds, maybe thousands of lives, because it buffered the blast towards heavily populated West Beirut. So it's an interesting thing. It's there are tensions. It's not easy, as you said, largest per capita number of refugees in any country in the world, and it's not easy to be host to that many refugees. The equivalent in the U.S. would be 100 million Syrians. It would be the equivalent of all of Mexico and all of Canada suddenly living in the United States. That would change our everyday lives. And there's a lot of tension, and a lot of it is understood and understandable, and some of it is unfortunate. And there's sectarianism and discrimination, and we try to work with all communities. Something like this happens, you do see some coming together of communities, but I think it will be difficult. I mean, there is a lot of international attention on responding to the Beirut blast, which is mostly Beirutis and Lebanese. What does that mean for the ongoing struggles of COVID and economic and employment struggles of citizens across the community, residents across the communities?
Well, on the show, we try to supply situational insight, but also actionable guidance from C-suite leaders navigating their organizations through difficulties. And the idea that we build the overall resiliency of the sector by learning from one another. So I want to change lanes a little bit and talk to you as CEO, well, you are CEO, of ANERA, and how you've sort of managed your response here. Within you're clearly committed to Lebanon, Beirut, and the areas which you were already serving. But what have been the biggest organizational challenges you faced, and what have you done to overcome them?
Great question. I mean, the biggest piece of the answer is that I didn't have to do a lot because we have a great team on the ground. I mean, I reckon I've been at ANERA only 3 years of its 52 years, and I came to an organization that was doing development right and doing humanitarian assistance right. There's been a lot of literature over the past few years about local systems, local leadership, country ownership, sometimes referred to. But I think the idea that we're really led by our country teams, and our Lebanon country director Samar Al Yasir is a development expert working in development for many years, and they're working in the communities they grew up in and that they studied in and they've worked in, and so that they know what the issues are and they know what the best responses are. So the main thing I had to do was check in with them, listen to them, hear what they're thinking, and they had to make a tough decision early on in the immediate aftermath of the blast, and that is, do we continue to try to do our programming, most of which is outside of Beirut, or do we throw everything, all of our resources towards Beirut? And they made the decision that we have to try to keep doing our regular programming, but also try to respond as best we can to the Beirut blast. And I think because the team and the organization have a good reputation there, they work well, we had good partnerships already, we're seeing we're seeing support for us working on the Beirut blast response. And if we can do that while we maintain all of the other programming, then we'll be doing our work right. And a big challenge, and this is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about and talking about with our country director and the team, is how, even when the problems, the response, the programs, the funding really has become acutely humanitarian assistance, how do we ensure we keep doing development programming? And one is what I mentioned. We've adapted our vocational training program so that we're still working with youth and local partners on delivering technical and durable skills, life skills or job skills that can be useful for a career. But now, instead of working in a technical area where the jobs have dried up, we have youth making 1.7 million face masks. Mm-hmm. And so it's humanitarian response, but we're still doing human development, sustainable development. And we're even looking at, how does some of this become revenue generating? How do we attract impact investing, where we say we're not only responding to this humanitarian crisis, but we're thinking about building back better. We're thinking about how do you have programs that are sustainable because you can get impact investors interested in the work because there is a return on investment to be made, or a savings because we prevent the need to spend money that needn't be spent on treating a health problem or an economic problem. So we're looking increasingly on how do we ensure we keep doing human development even as we're doing humanitarian response. And I think we're doing a pretty good job of that. And I think it's because we're constantly thinking about it, and we've got the team on the ground who can do it. But it's a challenge. And as I said, our medical donations may increase tenfold. How do we ensure we keep doing that right? And we're doing some pieces of that are new. We have some new donors. We have some new pieces of that process. For instance, we're in charge of the delivery of those medical donations to some new recipients in Beirut. And so, how do we do what we normally do, but at a jumped up scale, and keep doing it right without making mistakes, and continuing to ensure that we're meeting the objectives of human development.
Yeah, no, understood. It's a balance, right? Because we also have the same balance and somewhat sort of tensions at Airlink. We were responding for all the COVID-19 responses, and the Beirut explosion, recently the hurricane in the US, and of course that disrupts your ongoing programming about building the sector and building the sector's ability to respond from Airlink's perspective, from a logistical sense, and really building up sort of the ability and capacity of the sector to respond. I understand. And then you're also faced with this feast or famine, because this is a high profile on the news, lots of support, but then that can sometimes, if not oftentimes, most times, quickly wane once it falls out of the news cycle. So that's very challenging. And then you need to continue on to the programs that and continue on with the programs that really are more impactful over the long run. So I understand the challenge and the balance. So Sean, looking back over the breadth of your career, you've been at ANERA now 3 years of its over 50-year history. What would you say has best prepared you for the role that you're in right now, and running this humanitarian organization?
Well, I do think it's a few of the things together rather than any one. I think I worked in U.S. Congress as a staffer on the Internet House, then called the House International Relations Committee. I worked in the executive branch in the Obama administration as chief of staff and COO at USAID. That was a big help. I worked with a lot of fantastic people in the Obama-Biden administration. One of my earliest jobs, my first real permanent job, was with the National Democratic Institute. You mentioned I was in Jerusalem for 2 years with NDI, but I worked with them a total of 13 years. And something that NDI was doing well even 30 years ago was recognizing that no country, no organization, no person has all the answers, and it wasn't about saying, hi, we're from the United States, we're here to help, we have the answers. In fact, much of the good work that NDI did, and I see it now in ANERA's work, is because it is involving fully people who really know the situation. And so in NDI's case, it was, if you're going through a democratic transition in your country, maybe someone from your neighboring country who went through that recently will be more useful to you than someone from the US or Sweden or Switzerland. And in the same way, I think at ANERA, I realized very quickly the strength of our work, of our programs, is that we're led by the people who are working in the communities that they grew up in and that they know and that they're part of. So I think every job I've had that helped me realize that, we certainly have years of experience working on humanitarian assistance and development in the U.S. But the community has grown to realize it's not the answers, and the leadership and the funding and the ideas aren't all out of a couple of OECD nation capitals. They're coming from every corner of the world and all kinds of people, and innovations and ideas are coming from everywhere, and they're probably more likely to work if they're coming from the context and the community that you're trying to work in. And so I think I've learned that along the way, and hopefully am ensuring that that's how we work at ANERA.
That's interesting, and thank you. And I always like to try and end on a positive note, and I think you may have already just touched on this on a couple of your points. But you've had experience with large government organizations and now smaller mid-sized nonprofit, and of all those things, do you think there's some things each larger organizations, whether they're corporate or government departments, can learn from smaller, more agile nonprofit entities?
Well, I mean, I guess the obvious thing, maybe even a cliche, is the agility, right? Because we're fairly small, we can work pretty quickly in a pretty agile way. We've got a good board of directors who helps make sure that we do that. I mean, I remember we have one board member had worked for giant multinational companies, and we were having a discussion about updating our technology, and he gave sage advice to not spend too much time on money on that. That it may be you're working on something that doesn't need fixing or doesn't need as much fixing as you think it needs. Not to say we're not updating our technology, but it was a conversation about platforms, and it reminded me that if you're small, maybe you can ensure a little more easily that you're constantly focused on what your objective is, and you're spending your time and your attention, your resources on that, rather than something that might take you down a path that you don't really need to be taken down. We have to ensure we've got a variety of voices and experiences and opinions, which maybe can be a little harder in a smaller organization, although I think we do well. The real strength of ANERA is that it was established by a number of individuals and organizations, both Arab American and non-Arab American. And so that's given it a strength that helps us all the time, because we've got people who know the communities and the context we're working in, and we have people who don't know it as well, but have a relationship and affinity, a reason to be involved, which gives strength to the communities that otherwise could sometimes feel hopeless. Sometimes people say to me, wow, you're working with us, with Palestinians, with Lebanese, to help us, and you're not of us, you're not from us. That's a great support. And so I don't want to lose that either. I think we're strong because we're where the programs are run by people from the communities where we're running it. But I think it also helps to have people with an outside perspective that can bring in other talents and resources and support, moral support and intellectual support and financial support to say we're in this with you as well. You're not alone, and that's a huge strength. And you think about just about any problem at a village or community level or a nation or global level, we are all in it together. And so the extent that we can wrangle and corral different experiences, perspectives, knowledge, resources towards that problem will give us a better chance of getting good outcomes on it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sean. I think that's probably all we have time for today. It really only remains for me to thank you for your time. I really do appreciate you spending that time, and I'd like to thank you and your staff for all you're doing at the moment to help the people of Lebanon in Beirut. Thanks again, Sean.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a real pleasure. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. And please be sure to join me next time, and please like or subscribe Airlink's channel. Until next time, from Washington, D.C., this is Steve Smith wishing you and your family good health and clear skies. Goodbye.